Welcome to a podcast about the adventures of a divorced entrepreneurial father. Now, this is a hub of stories, cautionary tales, and life lessons behind the daily struggle to do better and be better and ultimately to find new sparks in life. And even if no one listens to any of these episodes, but I leave something behind for my children that sparks something in or even for them, well, that's good enough for me. However, if you do like what you hear on SparkHub, please support us by linking to the show notes below each episode. And once you're there, please consider subscribing to this podcast on the platform of your choice. And for the best experience, our newsletter gives you the inside scoop, exclusive content, and advanced previews of what's coming next. And by the way, your data is always private with us. We don't sell it, and you can unsubscribe from all of that at any time you want without judgment. So let's begin. My name is Allan, and I have a heck of a story for you. Welcome to part 2 of Entrepreneurial Life Lessons and how I ended up in this bizarre, risky, rewarding line of work. Now, this episode will be very layered and very deep, but I promise you a full circle reward awaits you if you can get to the end. And perhaps in all this, moreover, you can learn from my mistakes and some successes and ups and downs, and hopefully this sparks something in you if you are entrepreneurial at any level. I just wanted to recap part 1. If you haven't listened, you should, but if you haven't, the first lesson I learned was a Disneyland high school music trip, which taught me about the value of practice, but then just winging it when you're on stage in front of a large audience and ultimately getting them to cheer. From my brief time in law enforcement, I learned about integrity and reputation, which paid dividends and earned me unforeseen, but totally legal, money that I didn't anticipate in a completely different environment. My friend Jean-François taught me about empathetic judo and the power of perception change. From the bears of the Rocky Mountains when I lived in Whistler, I learned about blustering and how to think bigger to outwit danger instead of taking on a dangerous fight. And we ended part 1 with a powerful conversation in Whistler with someone at Microsoft who changed the course of what I would do next. So in this episode, we'll dive through the final few chapters that led me to becoming an entrepreneur and all the lessons I learned along the way, including how I convinced several companies to sponsor a group of us to travel through Australia, a death threat from the Middle East, how my brother's spirit guided me to an opportunity that got me to where I am today, and some battles with a Swedish con man and a blustering man I'm going to call Scottish Trump. So we pick up the story after the conversation on the front courtyard of the Shadow Whistler Resort with this big cheese from Microsoft, and I'm a 24-year-old doorman and valet making lots of cash, but worried I haven't found a dedicated career path after 6 years of consistent post-secondary education and working since I was 14 years old. Now, I forgot to mention in the last episode something quite crucial. It was a series of questions that the man from Microsoft asked me during that fateful conversation, and it all came back to me after I recorded. So I remember him asking me, "Are you in debt?" And I said, "No." "Have you made anyone pregnant?" he asked. And I said, "No." And he asked me if I was financially or contractually obliged to anyone that I couldn't get out of fast. And I said, "Yeah, nothing I can't get out of." Then he said, and I'm paraphrasing because it was a long time ago, but it was something to the effect of, if those conditions existed for me when I was 24 years old, and I knew what I knew now, I'd tell myself to go back and work in a ski resort for a year, make cash, party, enjoy nature, and then travel the world before starting my career or getting married and having kids. It's too late for me now, but make no mistake, I would change circumstances with you in a heartbeat. Now, I'm paraphrasing what I vaguely remember, but certainly the changing circumstances with me was the part I remembered the most. And at this point in the tale and at that stage of my life, returning to a career in law enforcement was firmly off the cards. But I wasn't exactly thrilled about working in hotels forever either. Between Ottawa, Banff, Alberta, and Whistler, British Columbia, I was about 4 years long on front-of-house roles in the 5-star hospitality game. And I was thinking about what Microsoft man said. Don't rush, don't put all your eggs in one basket. But I do have an exaggerated sense of urgency, and I didn't want to be idle for too long, even at the age of 24. Now, the thing about Whistler is that it is full of wild animals. It is full of party people. It's full of rich people, but also a lot of Australians. And I remember we used to call them the chairlift mafia because loads of Aussies ran the chairlifts, bars, restaurants, pretty much anything and everything in Whistler. It was a Commonwealth thing. Australians could work in Canada and Canadians could work in Australia on something called a work holiday travel visa, but you could only get those visas before the age of 30. Now in Whistler, there are two major mountains that drew people from around the world. There was Blackcomb Mountain and Whistler Mountain, and both were massive. Both went above the clouds. So if you wanted to get to the peak of either to see the stunning views or ski or snowboard down the slopes, you had to take 3 chairlifts or gondolas to the top. Or you could go up the mountain in thirds and tackle one section at a time. I guess I can't really describe how big these mountains are. You just have to see it to believe it. But the crucial thing to understand is that if you make it to either peak, you rise above the clouds and the view is inspiring. And it's very symbolic for what I was worrying about in my life. You know, what view would I get in life? How high could I go? What could I achieve? And that plagued me. And one day, an Aussie told me something about the 3 ways to ski or snowboard Whistler or Blackcomb Mountains. The Chairlift Mafia told me there were essentially 3 ways to get to the peak. You bought a lift ticket was the first way, and that could be full price or on sale, but you basically paid for the chairlift. The other way was if you knew one of the Chairlift Mafia or the lifties, and they snuck you through, you could get to the top, but that risked getting both the liftee and whoever he or she was sneaking caught and banned from the mountain. So it was very dark arts. The third way was that if you were willing to walk from the bottom to the top of Blackcomb or Whistler, you could ski or snowboard for free because you've earned it. It would take hours to make that hike on 2 legs, up a steep profile, carrying heavy gear. So option 3 was only really for the healthy and dedicated, and those who rose at dawn and hoped to ski by lunchtime. And such was the hike. It turned out that these 3 chairlift mafia routes that were taught to me to get to 2 of the world's most sought-after peaks were a metaphor for life and careers. You either worked really hard to reach a peak, you knew someone who could open doors for you, or you had the money to take a lift. But any day, I was told, any day you wanted to ski or snowboard on the hallowed mountains of Whistler or Blackcomb, you always had those options available to you. You just had to make a choice. That's what the Aussies taught me. Now, in my case, working at the Fairmont Shadow Whistler, I had a seasonal lift pass to get to the top of the mountain through an employee benefit scheme, so it was kind of hybrid. I was getting a discount on a very expensive season pass, but I had to work long hours to earn it and keep it, and I never did go for option 3. I never climbed the mountain from bottom to top. I probably would have died, and you may have remembered that story I told about what happened to my brother and I in Banff, but anyway, you'd have to listen to that episode. So one day, I was on the summit of one of the mountains, and I was reflecting on everything Microsoft Man told me, and I decided I wanted to go to Australia as my next move. Now, firstly, unlike many of my friends, I had no student debt. I'd paid for university by working night shifts at the Chateau Laurier. In fact, I came out with money in the bank, I had cash from tips, and I had a good bank balance. I hadn't made anyone pregnant, nor was I attached to anyone financially. I was 24 years old, and the travel visas would only be an option for me for the next 6 years, so kind of if not now, then when? So after a year in Whistler, my brother Simon and I took a 2-month road trip down the west coast to Canada and the US, from Whistler to San Diego, California. Then we went across the bottom of the US and back up the east coast to Montreal. Now, our car didn't have any air conditioning, so when we were driving through the hot states, we would often drive at night with ice cubes and wet towels on our neck. And on the roof, we had our bikes, so wherever possible, we would park up and off-road through some beautiful landscapes. Now, what was more, Simon and I had made so many friends with American customers visiting Whistler. Sadly, not the Microsoft Man, but many others. These are people we'd often take out drinking or skiing when we were off duty at the hotel. And so we had a bunch of phone numbers and addresses scribbled on napkins, matchboxes, hotel header paper. And we just kept stuffing those in a jar. And so now we were traveling through the US. We had places to stay and adventures thrown at us kind of wherever we went. Or we had referrals to other family members to put us up. So we didn't really spend too much money, and we had an amazing trip. And remember, this was at a time way before mobile phones and social media. So it was all paper and call boxes. Now, my brother Simon said to me about that jar, your network is your net worth. And I never forgot that. We built a network and now we were traveling the US having a great time. And once we got back to Montreal, I secured a visa to Australia and I started traveling west, stopping briefly back in Whistler before going to Hawaii and Fiji over the span of a month, and then landing in Sydney, Australia with nothing but a backpack and kind of no idea what I was going to do next. And I started off in a hostel looking at pinup boards for jobs and also looking to people who were looking for roommates. Now, here's where I learned another massive entrepreneurial lesson that led me to eventually beat the Australian tax office in a court of law, which I'll come to in a minute. The visa I was on essentially allowed me to work for 3 consecutive months in one company, but it expired after 12 months. So if I were looking for any corporate roles or long-term positions, it was impossible on that visa. So my options were kind of reduced to what they call traveler jobs, like the reverse of chairlift mafia in Whistler. I was on the other side now. So things like picking fruit, labor, bar work, hotel work, which could be anything from cash under the table to a paycheck with tax deducted at source. Then a horrible thing happened to me, but I learned a valuable lesson. One afternoon, I saw an ad marked "No experience necessary, big money." And it led me to a seminar where I learned that I could become a telesales agent for an event company. And they welcomed travelers and could provide a permanent visa if we performed well. The only catch was that the base pay was low, but there was big commission for anyone who could generate sales. So I kind of had nothing else going on at the time. So I applied and I was trained to become a high pressure sales agent working in what I called a boiler room. It's a movie if you haven't seen it, but a boiler room is like a room full of people in suits grinding down lists, calling prospects, trying to generate phone sales for corporate events. I'll never forget the video they played us on the first day. It was a video of the founder, and the company was named after him. And he was sitting in a velvet chair in a tailored suit with a bling watch and jewelry, and he was on a yacht, and he was promising riches to anyone who overshot their sales targets. And the founder reassured us that he was once one of us, and he worked his way up and he achieved all his great success through telesales, and we could too. Now, obviously, in later life, I discovered that was a pyramid scheme, but at the time, I needed a gig. So I think I was there for just over, I think it was 2 months. And I was grinding Monday to Friday, and I absolutely hated it. I had to constantly call people I didn't know off a list of leads and try to trick them or skirt around PAs and exec assistants. And essentially, I was being taught by hotheads how to bend the truth, but still stay legal and try to slam in some sales. And it went against my integrity. I felt like I was blustering. I became a blusterer. And now I think about it, I had nothing else to go on to earn money at the time. So I kind of stuck with it. There was what I used to call the pit boss. This was a heavily made up older woman who was constantly hovering over us, holding rallies to fire us up, listening in on our calls to give us tips, and pointing at boards and ringing bells so the office would cheer when a sale was made and make those of us who weren't closing any sales feel a bit guilty. Now, high pressure doesn't even begin to cover it, and the thing I remember the most was constantly getting up and down to drink water and go to the bathroom because I hated being at my desk, working up the nerve to pick up the phone and try and make a sale. I eventually lied and told the leadership at the time that I needed to leave because a relative was ill, which was not true. And I'm ashamed that I had to lie. But I didn't know what else to do to get out of this horrible job and try to save face. And at that stage, I was willing to do anything but telesales. But then an incident led to a major discovery. I learned that you could get around the limitations of the travel visa in 2 ways. If you went to the Australian tax office, you could register as a sole trader for, I think it was $50, meaning you could file your own taxes and, take your own revenue and have post-tax income, and you could have expenses and tax write-offs. Or you could set up a limited company. I think it was about $100 or $120. You could set up a limited company, name yourself as director, put through expenses, pay much less tax, and essentially have more legal protection if anyone ever wanted to sue you. So I discovered all this through a number of conversations and reading, and as I discovered, certain companies preferred to pay sole traders or limited companies instead of hiring people because it saved them a lot of human resource and paperwork hassle. So with a limited company, you were in control of your cash flow, but it required much more financial literacy, remembering to save and pay your taxes, and working with an accountant and not expecting a holiday or sick pay if you needed time off. So those were the downsides. But that was a major lesson for me. Understand all your options when it comes to making money. Financial and legal literacy is crucial in anything you do, and you'll see how that lesson paid dividends down the line. Now, my company was called Will's World Limited, and I'm sort of laughing about it now, but I was young and I didn't know better. So over time, I found some gigs doing promotional work for a variety of companies, anything from handing out flyers at train stations to free samples like booze, mouthwash, whatever. And I eventually landed a dream gig driving big 4x4s that had trailers with big screen TVs in the back. We were going to beaches and sports arenas to promote Xbox video games from Microsoft. At this point in the story, I had also managed to convince 3 women living in the famous Bondi Beach area of Sydney to take me on as a roommate when their ad explicitly said no male roommates. Now, I guess I had a little bit of sales ability, but unlike my first job in telesales, I sold them with integrity and no bluster. So I was living the dream. I had the eastern beaches of Bondi, Bronte, and Tamarama right outside my door. Really cool roommates, professionals. I was working in promotions. I was running my own company, and I started to volunteer at the Australian Centre for Photography, where every hour I volunteered, I could use their photo studio for free. So then I began to sell myself as a photographer, notably for modeling and headshots. And I made good profit on every shoot because although I had to pay, or actually better expressed, expense, film rolls and film development, I didn't need to pay for an expensive studio with lighting. I simply banked lots of volunteer hours, and my time became far more valuable by booking shoots. So that was a big lesson. Never underestimate the power of helping and volunteering instead of chasing paid work to get exposure and opportunities and generate savings. Now, I was gigging all around Sydney, doing promo work, meeting aspiring models, booking them for photo shoots. And one day, someone advised I should go to register for work with an extras agency because Sydney at the time was enjoying a bit of a Hollywood film boom, and I could get 12 to 14 hours of well-paid work on TV and movie sets as a background actor, an extra. So one day, I wandered into what I was told was one of the best extra agencies in Sydney. Now, I was holding a CV and some headshots, and ahead of me was a long line of people. At the head of the line was a very small, hunched man who I learned later was the head booker of the agency. And he was just rejecting everyone. Too short, too tall, too pale, too dark, too young, too old. He was just literally grinding through this line of people like a reality show judge who was trigger happy and just rejecting everyone. And my confidence was falling the closer I got. And then I got down to one person in front of me and I was next. And I was assuming the worst, but then something really bizarre happened, which changed my life. The mouse that the head booker was using on his computer stopped working just as I stepped in front of him. And he was distracted, banging his mouse and ignoring me, and he was shouting. And I channeled a little bit of Jean-Francois's Zen perspective energy, and I politely asked him if I could help. It felt to me like he noticed me for the first time, and he made some gruff comment and said, "Look, if you can fix this kid, it'll be a miracle." And then he just made an excuse to have a break, and he shouted at everyone in line behind me that they weren't taking any new talent. They were shut for the day, and the head booker walked off to, I think he smoked a cigarette or something. Now, I was pretty good with computers, and we always had computers in my home when I was growing up, so I checked his mouse, and it was the type of mouse in the days where there was like a little ball inside. So I checked that, made sure it wasn't dusty. I looked at the cable, make sure it was plugged in, and I checked the drivers on his computer, and it turned out he had to install a new one. Now, I can't remember what the exact issue was, but by the time he came back from his break, I had his mouse working. And I was ready just to walk away. And he said, "Whoa, where are you going?" He said, "Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Are you available tomorrow to be on the set of Home and Away, which was a very popular Aussie soap, and it was filmed in the Northern Beaches?" And I said, "Yeah." So he said, "Great. Here's the call sheet." And that began another side hustle, being on TV and film sets as an extra, where I met so many people that I spent hours with every day who needed headshots. So it was like shooting fish in a barrel, and that opened much more business for me as a photographer. And then another time I went by the agency, and the head booker, his printer wasn't working. And he went, "Hey, you fixed my mouse. Can you fix this?" So I fixed that for him, and he spun around and said, "Would you like to be on the set of Matrix 2 for the week?" I said, "Yeah." And then over time, the friendship developed. He trusted me, and I fixed his tech. And then I told agency man I was a photographer, and suddenly he took my business card and he started promoting me to all these wannabe actors that were coming by his agency every day who needed headshots. So the lesson I learned there was that opportunity favors the prepared. So never underestimate learning lots of stuff and offering to help. You never know what doors it'll open. And I was loving life in Australia, so much so that as my visa came up for expiry after a year, I wanted to stay longer because I'd built a business. Then I discovered that because I ran a limited company, or rather, I was a director of a limited company, I could apply for endless 3-month business visas to stay legally in the country, but I had to leave Australia to get that visa. And the kicker was that the visa cost $20 and took about 5 minutes to renew, but I had to do it outside the country. And Australia is the only country that's an island, or one of the biggest islands anyway. So on 2 occasions, I flew out in and out of Auckland, New Zealand, and they called it the visa run, on the same day. So I never actually left the airport or saw New Zealand. I just went in and out. And on my 3rd occasion, I flew to Bali for a week, and they called that the visa run. So it was a thing. I was just constantly meeting these people coming in and out every 3 months. Now, there was an important lesson here. Always know about loopholes, legal ones. The fact that the Australian Immigration Office and the Australian Tax Office didn't cross-check these things or have any cleared guidelines was kind of not my issue. I was legally allowed to stay in Oz and run Will's World Limited that serviced many different clients for many different things. And I have one final story from the land down under before I get to the court case. I'd made some friends, Louise, who was a travel writer, Craig, who was an aspiring documentary maker, and Aaron, who was my roommate, but he was also just a really wise guy beyond his years. And together we created a little project called the Mad Nomads, and our slogan was Wonder, question mark, wander, exclamation mark, wonder, wander. Now here's the background. At the time, the news was full of the rumblings of the Second Iraq War and Australia's involvement in the conflict. It was sort of down the lines of, should we be supporting this type of thing? And there seemed to be a lot of unease and debate and generational divide over what was right and what was wrong. So the 4 of us wanted to wonder and wander and create a documentary about young people traveling around Australia, interviewing the elders of the land about their insight and wisdom for our generation. And to cut a long story short, I took on the mandate of finding sponsors for the project. And I was offering sponsors nothing more than exposure for their brand on a blog website that we would promote to the media, as well as logos in a potential book we may write, and possibly a mention in a finished documentary we had no idea we could even produce. So I designed 3 sponsorship packages, gold, silver, and bronze, and I went to work. Now, as I look back, I mean, it wasn't much to offer anyone, really, let alone big corporations, but honestly, I didn't know any better at the time, and there was nothing else to do. So I made a list of potential sponsors who could provide vehicles, cameras, film, online hosting, and anything else we needed. And I wrote and sent out dozens of proposals by email, by letters, and by pulling up the phone. I was back into telesales mode, but for something I cared about. And I promptly heard nothing. And then I remembered the training from my first job in telesales, and I was disciplined about calling and following up and making lists and keeping track of what I said to who, and just being relentless until I either got the right person, and they gave me a firm no, but actually I got a lot of, we'll think about it, call us later. So we were about to give up on the whole thing when something happened. Company in Canada called Blacksun offered to host our website, madnomads.net, for free. Don't go there now, it doesn't work anymore, but that's what it was called. So we had our first sponsor, and then I called the other sponsors back to tell them we had our first sponsor. Then one day I was developing some film after a shoot, and I told the development shop owner that what I was doing with Mad Nomads, and they offered me free development of all photography shot on the Mad Nomads journey for a mention on our website and everywhere else. So they took a bronze package so I could mail in the film from around the country, and they would develop it and have it ready when we got back. So we had our second sponsor from one conversation. Now, I started to call all the other prospects back, and that's when a feeding frenzy erupted. Fujifilm offered me a stack of free premium film. Nikon, which was the cameras I always used, suddenly heard about the Fuji deal and offered me a free prototype digital camera. It's the very first digital SLR, the D100. That might mean something to someone, but it was literally one of the first digital cameras on the market. Would have cost tens of thousands of dollars. We had one for free on loan for 3 months. Then Sony offered to loan us a broadcast quality camera and some tapes. Then Motorola called me with some free walkie-talkies, and there was a vehicle decal company who offered to create Mad Nomads branding on magnetic decals so that we could literally slap that on the side of any vehicle that we traveled in and be branded all the time Mad Nomads. So in a matter of weeks, we went from nothing to 9 sponsors, gold, silver, bronze, and all of that triggered by getting one on board, then another, and then just following up constantly. But as good as all that was, we still had no way to drive around Australia. Then I got the call that changed it all. A guy from Brits called. Brits is spelled B-R-I-T-Z. And it was a vehicle outfit that rented out a variety of modified adventure vehicles, from 4x4s to off-road vehicles with fold-out tents on the roof to motorhomes. Now, the Brits guy had seen how many sponsors we had, but moreover, he'd seen my photography portfolio and decided to make me a slightly different offer. He was clear. He didn't care about Wonder Wander. He didn't care about our mission or being on a blog or on a website or in a book or in a documentary. He didn't care. He saw a completely different opportunity. Brits were releasing a fleet of 5 new vehicles, and they needed those vehicles photographed and videoed all over the country, ideally shot in iconic landscapes, for a new catalog. So he offered that if I used my film, my cameras, my skills, and I shot their vehicles in still in motion formats in beautiful locations as we traveled the land, he would give us 3 months of free Brits rentals, rotating through the 5 different vehicles at different points around Australia. And also, they would heavily discount a fuel subsidy, so we didn't have to pay as much for the gas. Now, that's when I learned a huge entrepreneurial lesson. Sometimes you set out to pitch things one way, but then other things happen, and what you offer changes a value proposition. So Brits guy valued what we could produce for them, not initially what we pitched. But I got in front of him, and that was the important thing. And remember the lessons I've already talked about? Practice, but be ready to improvise, which I learned in Disney World, and have integrity, and don't bluster like a bear. All of that paid off. So now we had everything we needed. But then Craig, the cameraman, dropped out. I don't remember why. So it was just Aaron, Louise, and I, the Mad Nomads, and we headed off for a 3-month odyssey, creating unforgettable blog content, photography, and videos from the most scenic locations in Australia. And I'm going to skip the detail of that journey for now and fast forward to month 16 of my time in Australia after Mad Nomads wound down, and it was basically time to go. I couldn't afford to keep going in and out of the country every 3 months, and I had nothing to ground me career-wise, lifestyle-wise, romance-wise, and I hadn't seen my family in almost 2 years, and Australia really is far away. That's why I call it the Golden Handcuffs, because it's gorgeous and it's beautiful, but you're trapped there. So I worked with my accountant to prepare my final tax return, wind up Will's World Limited, and we calculated that I was owed about 4,000 Australian dollars from the ATO, the Australian Tax Office. But then I got a letter from the ATO saying they reassessed me, and I owed them $4,000 because my income should have been taxed under my travel visa status, not a business. So I took the ATO to court, and I won because I really knew my stuff, and I got a check for 4,000 Australian dollars was issued to me as I left the country to fly back to Canada with a duffel bag full of books and memories and much more. And at this point, I'm now 26 years old. And I asked my mom and dad if I could move home until I figured out my next move. And they said yes, but I had to live in the basement and pay rent. Now, I knew I wanted to write a book about my time in Australia and the Mad Nomads journey. I just had to do it, but I also needed money. So I reverted to something I did in university. I stayed up all night writing, but then I worked during the day. And in university, I used to work at night and go to school in the day. One day, I walked into an investment seminar and I met someone who took a shine to me, and he offered me a job as a floating teller in the bank. So to be clear, being a bank teller is not glorious or well paid, nor, like policing or hotels, a career I thought I would entertain very long term. But the fact that I could be on call and make my own schedule and move around meant I could earn money while writing my book and maybe building up a new business. And I also used to print my manuscripts off of the bank's printers to save money. So I was floating around Montreal, writing my book, earning money, gaining experience in the bank world. Got my mom, who's an artist, to create the cover for my book. I included photography in the book as well as the logos of all our sponsors, because I promised I'd do that if I ever wrote a book, and I felt obliged to them. So finally, I had a draft manuscript and select photography, and I started to send synopses and letters to publishers and literary agents, hoping someone would ask for my manuscript and make my book a reality. I really believed in myself. But no one else did, and I must have received dozens of rejection letters. And you can imagine rushing to the mailbox and waiting for these letters to come in, and they come in thick and fast. And all of them said, no, thank you. Some were a little more supportive. And I ended up looking into the self-publishing option, which in those days was something for the desperate. But I didn't know that at the time, so I did it anyway. I learned a lot about typesetting. I had to learn about registering with various libraries to make sure your book was legal. I had to design stuff. So let's flash forward to my parents' garage. It's full of boxes with copies of my books from my first print run that I'd pay for myself and I hoped to recoup. Now, remember how I told you the story about selling citrus fruits in high school so I could go on that trip to Disneyland? Now I was selling my own book to friends and family, hosting launch parties at my house, and I even got coverage in my local newspaper. And I managed to convince some local bookstores to take my book on consignment, and even some bookstores in Australia, little ones, not chains. But big picture, I didn't make much money for all the time I invested, if you look at it that way, but I learned a lot. And one day I was invited to be part of a Meet the Author night with some other self-published authors. Now, somehow in all this self-promotion I was doing, Kyle McDonald had heard about me. And Kyle bought a copy of my book. Then he reached out and I met him, and we met at this author event. Now, if you don't know the story of Kyle, he had his own book ideas at the time. And together, we teamed up and we went to New York City on several occasions and essentially tried to set up or barnstorm meetings with literary agents and publishers. Like we were two young bucks who had big dreams, no clue how it all worked, which is exactly what we were. And we learned that there are millions of aspiring writers out there writing manuscripts, and we kind of had no unique angle. And it was about then that Kyle started his One Red Paperclip blog. And you'll have to listen to that episode if you want to know more. But I joined him for a few months before deciding to move to London, UK, and not long after that, AreYouMyWife.com was born. So all of these tales I've just said are sort of the subjects of other episodes, but for this episode, about how I became an entrepreneur, it's important to understand my decision to move to the UK at that point. Competing in Disney taught me about practice and improvisation, police, integrity and reputation, Jean-Francois, empathetic judo, and patience, bears about bluster. A Microsoft leader taught me not to rush life and end up unhealthy. My brother reminded me your net worth is your network. Australia was all about taking big risks and finding rewards, but also learning to be legally and financially literate. And moving home to Montreal and writing my own book was a reality check and a little bit of humility. So now I'm 28 years old with all that experience, and yet I felt no firm career path, still nobody was pregnant, still no romantic connection, and I really wanted to do something creative with my life. So I set up Will's World Limited in Canada, and although I drew some work outside the bank as an extra on some movie sets and with a few photo shoots, it just wasn't anything near like what I'd created in Sydney. I was proud of my book, but I also had a British passport that I hadn't really used before, and I just remember thinking, London, it seems like this great place to pursue higher levels of ambition if you were creative. That's what I thought at the time. It's a global capital after all, and living in my parents' basement in Montreal wasn't exactly ideal. So I moved to London and contacted a British friend named Liz, with whom I'd worked with in promotions in Australia and befriended. And she herself at this point had moved back to her native Devon in the UK. Remember, your network is your net worth. It's who you know. So Liz told me to call someone she knew in London, and it was the co-founder and CEO of a digital image library company. And I went in heavy guns pitching myself as a photographer, but actually my work wasn't strong enough. I hadn't really done much in the UK at this point, and what they needed was a project manager to move them from one location to another. So like what happened in Australia with Mad Nomad sponsorship, I went in with one pitch and one idea, but another door completely opened that I didn't see, and I took it. And that was my first job in London, which lasted about 3 or 4 months, after which I started working in marketing agencies on the back of all my promotional experience from Sydney. And I tried and I failed to get gainful employment as a photographer. I tried pitching some book ideas to literary agents in the UK. And then I flew back to see Kyle to celebrate him getting a house through One Red Paperclip. And that's where I got dared to travel the world to meet a wife. And now we jump ahead to me as a married man at the age of 32, looking to settle into something more stable to start my family with a loving wife. And after I met my ex through Are You My Wife, I moved up the ladder in various agency roles as a business development and client service manager. So I was good at managing people, I was good at making clients happy, and I was earning good money. My ex and I were dinks, double income, no kids. And through a connection I had, we managed to live in the very desirable part of London called Islington for very low rent in a fabulous flat. And together, my ex and I always had enough between us to live well, take nice holidays, eat out, take risks if either of us wanted to change career path. And we had each other's backs. Then our first son was born. But I was out of the house working long days by this point, which was an expectation when you work in the marketing and production industry. Then we moved out of London to buy our first property, get on the property ladder, so a long commute was added onto already long days, with my ex being totally isolated at home nursing a baby while also nursing her own career dreams after giving up her career that she fought hard for and had to suspend, we thought at the time, temporarily. And then when our first son was 2 years old, two horrible things happened. On the personal side, my brother Simon took his own life, which is the subject of another episode. Then shortly after, we were expecting our second child. So there was a lot going on at the time. But on the professional side, my agency career to date had flourished, but it meandered a little bit through large global agencies and then back down to small boutique ones. And each of those had their own challenges, but the commonality was that it was my job to win and retain accounts. And at this point in my story, I'm working as an account director at a small, scrappy startup agency that had a specialism in mobile marketing, which at the time was a booming new sector. The CEO of the startup was desperate to scale and get wins on the sales board, so he was always lowballing the fees to new prospective clients in an attempt to win as much business as possible, even if it wasn't always the right client profile or he risked taking a financial loss. He was blinded by numbers. And I had a dilemma because I was seasoned enough by now to know when a prospective client was a bad fit, but I also had to keep the money coming in as the main breadwinner in our family for our mortgage and a new baby on the way and my ex taking a career break. One day, the CEO introduced me to a new prospect called Dr. Ibrahim, who came into our offices claiming he was related to the Saudi royal family, and he had a prototype medical platform under construction which he claimed would solve all the world's medical problems. Now, Dr. Ibrahim paid a handsome retainer up front to the CEO, and the CEO was delighted. But when it came down to actually getting under the skin and knowing exactly what we were meant to be doing with him, the details were vague, but the CEO basically said, keep him talking, keep him paying. So he signed many non-disclosure agreements and legal documents to keep the project a secret at the insistence of this ambitious Dr. Ibrahim. Now, I told the CEO up front that I smelled a rat. I smelled a dreamer, and I sensed this would go south if we didn't have integrity and we just kept taking money under false expectations when we really had no scope. And my integrity was screaming, but then I went home knowing I needed to keep the money flowing. So again, I felt compromised. Dr. Ibrahim grew more bizarre with each meeting, insisting at one meeting that Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook was personally surveilling him when he came to London with goons on every corner and trying to steal his patents and his ideas, when all the good doctor wanted to do was create the greatest medical platform in the world to heal everyone through their mobile device. I just can't make this stuff up, but the CEO kept insisting that we entertain Dr. Ibrahim because he kept paying us, until it came to a point where Dr. Ibrahim began to accuse us of scheming against him, and then he threatened to bring Saudi armed goons to our offices and gun us all down. It's horrible, and when it escalated to that point, we not only had to block his emails and texts, which kept arriving in all caps letters because it's like he was shouting, we also had to call the police to get a restraining order against him. And it got to a point where high-ranking politicians had to intervene to issue a warrant for his arrest should he come back to the UK, but the threats slipped through every now and then on email or text. He would change phone numbers or email addresses, accusing us of being Israeli spies and trying to deprive the world of his medical miracle platform. Now, the CEO had to give back the funds he received to clean break with this bizarre client, and it wasn't long after that incident that I left the small mobile agency to work in a larger global agency. But for months afterward, I was walking around London looking over my shoulder or suspecting people who looked of Arab descent of probably things they shouldn't be suspected of, because we didn't know what Dr. Ibrahim was capable of, and he just kept coming for a long time after that incident. Then a few months after my brother passed away, we took our son to Canada for a holiday, and my phone rang with a strange number, and I picked up, and it was Dr. Ibrahim screaming, "I got you. I'm coming to get you and your family, and none of you will live that now that you betrayed me." And it was horrific. It was horrific that I had to endure that, and it stressed me out. But in the end, nothing ever happened. But for almost 2 years, I was stressed that I might be under a fatwa, which is an Arabic word for a hit or a dead man walking, even if it was from a blustering madman. And the worst part is that had I listened to my integrity, to my gut when it was calling, and walked away from that client a lot sooner, maybe none of that would have happened. But I also couldn't let my family down by making a stand either. So what's more, I recognized bluster from Dr. Ibrahim when I saw it, but I didn't stand up to the CEO when I should have to chase that bear away. And once I was in a bigger agency role, I was flying. I became one of the highest earning client services directors in the group, which gave my ex and I confidence to move out of London to a larger home. We could renovate and be closer to family before our second child arrived. So family-wise, and despite that incident, we were stable. And I reflected on the advice from the Microsoft man in Whistler and all the choices I'd made to get to this point. I had traveled, I'd taken risks, I'd set up businesses in different countries, I tried lots of different career paths before launching Are You My Wife, which led me to someone I married and started my family with. And looking back now, the most asked question that came up when I was interviewing for marketing roles was about the 1 year gap on my CV marked, Are You My Wife? And when I explained what I did, it turned out that all the skills I'd gained on that journey were valuable to marketing agencies. Now, remember that lesson from Whistler? You had 3 ways to get to the top of the mountain? Well, in this case, I was at the top of my game in the marketing world because of Are You My Wife and the skills it generated in me, which allowed me to earn money. And I was gainfully employed in a creative industry, and I loved what I did. And during that phase of my life, I was drilled by my superiors that to be successful in business development and client services roles, which I did, you always had to demonstrate on demand the 5-to-1 rule. The 5-to-1 rule is that for every dollar or pound you took from a business, you had to show them that you could make over 5 times an ROI, return on investment, in revenue. So each week began with this benchmarking process and that rule. So I always knew how far off or how far ahead I was on the book value of my clients and the revenue I was generating. And I would then use that to plan my time accordingly between fixing and retaining business and winning new business. So I became so confident that I started to accept performance-based remuneration, meaning that I would take a lower salary, but I had more upside if I kept my accounts in the black or won new accounts, which I was getting good at doing. And now that I reflect, it was very a similar structure to that horrible telesales job that I had back in Sydney. But in that role, I hated selling things I didn't know or understand to strangers, whereas in the current role I had in London, I could be myself, I could bet on myself, my experience, my knowledge, my relationships to win accounts and keep clients happy, and build teams. And when it was all going well, it was exhilarating, and it allowed my ex and I to climb onto the property ladder and make some plans. However, there was one downside to working in marketing agencies. You could be fired at any time if the agency lost a key account, even if it wasn't your account. And you never really owned anything you created. The client always owned the work and the intellectual property. We just made it happen. So I wasn't really putting my fingertips on anything I could call my own. And then when everything felt like it was going well, a final swerve shoved me firmly into the risky entrepreneur lane. It was January 2015. My birthday is January 7th, and my brother Simon's birthday is January 8th. And Simon and I always celebrated our birthdays together. And on this date, it would be the first time that I would mark my birthday without having Simon alive. And it was horrible. And on this particular January 8th, I absolutely had to go to the office to close some lucrative deals. I didn't feel well, but I knew I had to sign some deals, which would secure a bonus. And at that time, our second son was due in 5 months, and we'd secured a mortgage for another home outside London. So I didn't feel well that day. I was very emotional and fragile and missing Simon, but I went in to just get this deal done, a couple deals done. And when I got to the office, an American from Chicago I didn't recognize pulled me into a room and essentially told me that our agency group was being acquired by a US firm and that I was being let go. When I asked why, he simply said, because I was too expensive. I asked him if he knew about the 5-1 rule, and he said no. I asked him if he'd actually read my contract, and he said no. I just needed to go. He was only there to fire me, so he didn't care, but I was indignant that he didn't know my backstory or how I'd achieved those numbers, about my battles, and he didn't even wish me happy birthday. But remember the lesson I learned in Australia about being legally and financially savvy that allowed me to beat the ATO in court and receive money instead of losing money. In this situation, I knew my employment contract better than him, and he was blustering. And in my contract, there was a notice period for 3 months. So the company had to honor my bonus for the deals I just signed not a few hours earlier and give me 3 months of salary, even if I was leaving that day. It was the first time this particular American had learned the UK term gardening leave, and I was the one to teach him. Nonetheless, I walked out of that meeting with the old weight of missing Simon on our birthday, and now this new weight of figuring out what I was going to say to my pregnant wife, that I just lost a once secure and heavily lucrative job as we were remortgaging and expecting another child. In all that haze, I had to go and give my team that I'd hand-built the news. I found out later they were gone a month later after me, and most of my clients left as well. And before all of that, before cleaning out my desk, and on the way out the building, bumping into a colleague who wanted to get me involved in a joint agency pitch, but when I told her the news, she was in disbelief because she knew I was one of the highest earners in the company. And she said, "Allan, I want to put you in touch with someone I think you have to meet. His name is Gregor." And that's all I had. I didn't have anything else than that, but a name and someone suggesting I meet someone else. Remember, your network is your net worth, right? So I remember vaguely that she wrote Gregor's details on a paper, and I stuffed it into my jacket, and I promptly forgot, walked out of this plush building for the last time, dejected that I had worked so hard only to be let go because I was basically too successful at winning, which was odd. However, I did have 3 months' pay and a bonus coming, so I had time. But at that moment, I really did not want to be in the marketing agency world anymore. Just like I felt about law enforcement and hotels and banking at one stage. It just felt to me that I didn't have any juice for that anymore. Now, as you can imagine, the news wasn't well received by the time I got home. But the next day I was hitting recruiters with my CV and contacting people in my network and grinding to find something new while I had time and money coming in. And I had this flashback one day of a calculator that my brother Simon once had on his desk, and he'd put like a strip on it where he stenciled in the words Wills Inc. Limited. Now, if you know anything about those letters, an incorporated company and a limited company are two different things, but for whatever reason, Simon wrote out Wills Inc. Limited on this calculator. And I remember he used to show it to me, and when we dreamed that one day we'd run our own business, maybe have our names on the door. Where there's a will, there's a way. But preceding his death, Simon and I hadn't lived in the same country for nearly 7 years after living together in Whistler. In fact, it was longer with Australia, maybe 9 years. So after being close for all our lives, life happened, and now I had a family and I was rooted in the UK. And I remembered all the time Simon would say, where there's a will, there's a way. And for some reason, I fixated on the memory of this calculator that he used to have with Wills Inc. Limited stenciled on it. And I remember I was about to take my jacket one of my jackets to the dry cleaner I had hundreds of applications out in the marketplace, and I needed to go dry clean some stuff. And I found this piece of paper with some details on it. It was Gregor's details. It was what that colleague had given me the day I was let go from the agency group. So I decided to email Gregor, and then I heard nothing and almost forgot about it. But my old telesales mad nomad sponsorship skills sort of kicked back in, so I followed up, and he responded, and we agreed to meet in London. And it was odd, because it was like going on a blind date where we're both just staring at each other, saying so-and-so said we should speak, but not really having much else to say. And nonetheless, there was something really familiar about Gregor. And it took me a while to realize, but he was almost exactly the same as my brother Simon in terms of his personality. Whereas I have a heightened sense of urgency and getting things done, I'm a bit more blunt. Gregor was calm, he was thoughtful, he was strategic, he had a great bedside manner, highly emotionally intelligent, and he could make a room listen to him, which was basically what Simon was like, and they even sort of smiled the same, which was odd. And as it turns out, Gregor was born and raised in Montreal. He was 10 years older than me, and in his own way, he was leaving a much higher level in the marketing world and not wanting to return to that industry. He wanted to bet on himself and creating his own ventures. So I'm not religious, but the fact that I received Gregor's details on my brother's birthday and that he was just like Simon was very uncanny, almost as if that Wills Inc. Limited thing would come true in a different way, as if Simon was telling me not to give up on the dream of running my own business or partnering with someone. And at that moment, Gregor was looking at working with a Swedish streaming company, and he said he could offer me about 2 weeks of consultancy, and after that, we would have to part ways. Well, we've been working together for over 10 years as of this recording, navigating several businesses together, co-creating two, a streaming brand called True Royalty TV and a well-being company called Rain. And in one particular case, early in our relationship, I went to support a business that Gregor was strategically involved in, but it was run by how do I describe him? A Swedish trust fund kid who didn't know what he was doing and went through a messy divorce while I was trying to rescue his company. And at one point, this Swedish man didn't pay me for 3 months. And I will never forget calling him while he was on a yacht in the Mediterranean, having just posted on social media that he'd bought a 25 grand watch, and begging him to settle one of my invoices so I could pay my bills and get my oldest son a bouncy castle for his 5th birthday. And he kept making excuses that his ex-wife was robbing him and he had to escape. But I needed to keep going and keep building his company. Don't give up. It was horrible. But then a lot of my learnings kicked in. I could tell he was blustering like a bear. But I knew the law and I knew the finances just like the ATO, so I threatened to release a large legal file, to a small claims court highlighting many of his hush-hush dealings, including taking investment cash and gold bars into a private bank instead of a company account. I hated doing that, but the problem was also I had other people I cared about who could have been collateral damage, but I protected them. I was honest with them, and by sticking with my integrity and applying my experience and knowing how to deal with people who bluster, I got paid, disassociated myself with a very unethical company, and walked away with connections and assets that eventually would lead to what is today Rain Wellbeing. Remember, your network is your net worth. But since 2015, when I met Gregor, I've been an entrepreneur, working for myself and having faith in myself and in my skills and my abilities, and really never going back to the corporate world or any of those other industries I used to work in. And I'm not ashamed to say I've lost a lot of bets. Bad things have happened, but I've won some that I didn't see coming. And that's kind of the joy of it. Now, I wonder what that guy from Microsoft who I met in Whistler would think of me now. And since 2015, with the experience I gained in Australia and Canada, I've set up other limited companies in the UK with my then wife, and we enjoyed financial stability, trading up and renovating beautiful homes in a beautiful village and giving our children a nice elementary school and idyllic childhood surroundings. So that's been the real payoff, is that time being around. And aside from still being part of two great enterprises that I co-founded, I also pick up different clients from my consultancy through word of mouth who are looking for growth architecture and business transformation, which is kind of where I've ended up. I also got to work from home a lot more, which meant I was present when my kids were young, and it was certainly better than not seeing them when I was in the marketing world. And financially, because of some of the protections we put in place, we've weathered the horrific COVID years as well as a cost of living crisis. However, it hasn't always been smooth sailing, because in 2024, my marriage ended. And this is kind of the reason I'm doing SparkHub. As of this recording, it's been 16 months that we've been still living together, trying to sell the house that we built. And I just want to conclude this two-part series with two final experiences that have left an unforgettable series of lessons on me. Once upon a time, I took on a client who I will call Scottish Trump. Now, everyone knows or should know Donald Trump, and whether you love him or whether you hate him, we can all agree that he blusters quite a lot, like a big bear, big orange one. Now, imagine a man like that, but Scottish. That's Scottish Trump, who pursued me for 2 years to help him with his streaming business. And after 2 years, I had some capacity, and I agreed to help him out through my consultancy, but I ensured the terms of our agreement were written out. I told him my modified 5-1 rule. For every dollar or pound you spend with me, I will either save you 5x or earn you 5x what you invest with me. So that's the modified one, save or grow. And he was yet to establish his business, and he'd made a lot of mistakes, So along the way, I noted all the savings that I was making along the way to prove the formula. I sensed that Scottish Trump might challenge my integrity, and certainly he blustered a lot, and I was right. It was all praise in the early days when we started working together, and when I pointed out fundamental flaws in his business, he started to turn a bit nasty, first blaming others that had been around him that he had brought in, and then he started blaming me directly for things, blaming me for problems he caused by blustering and exaggerating and overpromising to everyone from partners to investors to potential staff. He just burnt bridges everywhere he went, and I over-delivered everything he asked me to do. In fact, I can tell you precisely it was 11 to 1, not 5 to 1, but 11 to 1 in operational savings, which is double the 5-1 rule that I usually apply. But like Dr. Ibrahim, it was clear that Scottish Trump had mental issues, and he got nasty and delusional, and when his dream wasn't manifesting the way he wanted, it was horrible. Now, Scottish Trump never threatened my life or my family's life, but he did threaten my reputation and my integrity, and he would send these long, rambling emails with blame, saying he was not going to pay me, despite the fact that I over-delivered what we had scoped. So, I symbolically lifted my bike above my head and stood tall, just like I did to scare off the blustering bear and Whistler, and I channeled Jean-Francois's empathetic judo, and now, as you witnessed, when I overcame the ATO and the American who didn't understand my contract, or the Swedish con man, Scottish Trump bore witness to all of that experience in the form of a file I had on him, and the fact that I had a lawyer write a very specific letter. A war of words and threats to publicly expose me dragged on for months, and eventually he was forced to pay what he had contracted me to do. And that was rough, but actually, it wasn't that bad in the end because I had all my ducks in a row and I applied everything I'd been learning that you've been learning throughout this entire episode. Now, quickly contrast that with another client who asked me to help him scale his streaming business. This is now not Scottish Trump. This is somebody totally different. I outlined to this client how he could succeed and started to explain the steps, but he kept looking sheepish in the meetings, and eventually this client confessed that although he loved the ambition and the path that I could put him on, his religious upbringing meant that he had what he called himself a poverty mindset, meaning he couldn't imagine himself succeeding in life. He just couldn't get his head around it. Now, you'll recognize in all of these entrepreneurial encounters that to be good in this space, you need to just keep practicing different tunes. You need to have an ability to improvise and adapt in front of a crowd. You must always act with integrity and trade on a good reputation. You must learn to absorb bluster, but also know how to outwit danger rather than fight it head on. And always use judo moves backed by knowledge that takes the wind out of your opponent's sails. And remember, everything always comes full circle. Last spring, around May, I flew to San Francisco in order to drive to Reno, Nevada, to help a new client I had landed in the US. I was wearing a suit when I pulled up to the Grand Sierra Resort Hotel in Reno. There's a massive courtyard with snowy mountains in the background. I almost felt like I was back in Whistler, having driven through the Nevada mountains. I was sort of feeling that vibe again. And a doorman came up to me and asked if he could valet my car. In conversation, he asked what I did for a living, and I said I was a consulting entrepreneur. And he stood there and said, I really, really dream of doing what you're doing. And he started asking me questions, and I said, how old are you? And he said, I'm 24. And I asked him, are you in debt? He said, no. Have you got anyone pregnant? He said, no. Are you financially or contractually obliged to anyone that you can't get out of fast? And he said, no, not at all. You know what I wanted to tell the guy? I wanted to tell him so many things that you've just listened to over these past two parts. I wanted to say to him, learn to practice and improvise like a jazz musician, but always have integrity and a good reputation like a great cop. I wanted to tell him, learn to stand up and scare off blustering bears, but also know the fine art of empathetic perspective judo flips. I wanted to tell him to be open to conversations with people he thought had it all, but be ready to hear those people might switch with him at a moment's notice and envy his life. I wanted to tell him to remember that his network is his net worth. Volunteer for everything you can. You never know. Take risks. Travel while you can, because the rewards might not be what you expect. And understand the finance and the law, and have rules like 5-1 so you always have a benchmark and discipline. I wanted to tell him that despite all of that, I was also navigating a divorce with 2 children in the mix that I loved and worried about. Wanted to say all of that. In the end, all I said to him as I handed him my keys and a cash tip was, "Take your time, kid. Try everything. Go see the world first and take some risks. You'll never get this time of your life back. And just always learn to bet on yourself, and the rest should follow." And if you've listened to both parts of this mini-series about how I became an entrepreneur, thank you for taking the journey with me. I hope something sparked in you. And I'd like to end by playing a clip from the commencement speech given by Steve Jobs once upon a time.
Thank you. I'm honored to be with you today for your commencement from one of the finest universities in the world. Truth be told, I never graduated from college, and this is the closest I've ever gotten to a college graduation. Today, I want to tell you 3 stories from my life. That's it. No big deal. Just 3 stories. The first story is about connecting the dots. I dropped out of Reed College after the first 6 months, but then stayed around as a drop-in for another 18 months or so before I really quit. So why'd I drop out? It started before I was born. My biological mother was a young, unwed graduate student, and she decided to put me up for adoption. She felt very strongly that I should be adopted by college graduates, so everything was all set for me to be adopted at birth by a lawyer and his wife. Except that when I popped out, they decided at the last minute that they really wanted a girl. So my parents, who were on a waiting list, got a call in the middle of the night asking, "We've got an unexpected baby boy. Do you want him?" They said, "Of course." My biological mother found out later that my mother had never graduated from college and that my father had never graduated from high school. She refused to sign the final adoption papers. She only relented a few months later when my parents promised that I would go to college. This was the start in my life. And 17 years later, I did go to college. But I naively chose a college that was almost as expensive as Stanford. And all of my working class parents' savings were being spent on my college tuition. After 6 months, I couldn't see the value in it. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was, spending all of the money my parents had saved their entire life. So I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay. It was pretty scary at the time, but looking back, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. The minute I dropped out, I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me and begin dropping in on the ones that looked far more interesting. It wasn't all romantic. I didn't have a dorm room, so I slept on the floor in friends' rooms. I returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food with. And I would walk the 7 miles across town every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna temple. I loved it. And much of what I stumbled into by following my curiosity and intuition turned out to be priceless later on. Let me give you one example. Reed College at that time offered perhaps the best calligraphy instruction in the country. Throughout the campus, every poster, every label on every drawer was beautifully hand calligraphed. Because I had dropped out and didn't have to take the normal classes, I decided to take a calligraphy class to learn how to do this. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture, and I found it fascinating. None of this had even a hope of any practical application in my life. But 10 years later, when we were designing the first Macintosh computer, it all came back to me. And we designed it all into the Mac. It was the first computer with beautiful typography. If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. And since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have them. If I had never dropped out, I would have never dropped in on that calligraphy class, and personal computers might not have the wonderful typography that they do. Of course, it was impossible to connect the dots looking forward when I was in college, but it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. Because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart, even when it leads you off the well-worn path. And that will make all the difference.
Thank you for listening. To support SparkHub, please have a look at the show notes below this episode, or visit thesparkhub.com to sign up for our newsletter, which offers exclusive inside scoops. Just quickly, the music you're hearing is composed by Shi Hao Yan, and the audio engineering is done by Emily Chung. My name is Allan, and I hope that you dream big and something sparked in you today.